Boker Tov. Before we actually start today, I do want to note that here in the States, and really yesterday in Israel, is Yom HaAtzmaut, which is the day that we celebrate the victory of our people in the 1948 War for Independence, which actually ended in 1949 in March. And it was truly an incredible miracle. Many people actually have the custom of saying the Hallel prayer today, including myself. And it's an incredible thing to be able to celebrate Israel that we fought and prayed for. We prayed for 2,000 years and finally had the strength to fight for it. And now, God willing, we will never lose it again. So it's an incredible thing of joy. There's still a lot of work to do, but it's our home. And it's not just a place where we live. It's a place where we can work to make the world a better place through technology, through other means. But Israel is so important to our people in the world. And we really thank God that we got it back again. So with that in mind, we're going to go into today's lesson and welcome Isabel in the Parasha of Kedoshim and going to the idea about how Israel in an ideal state, ideally, not always, no country is perfect, but ideally they should be a shining light, an Or LaGoyim. They should be living principles that we learn from God that we hope other peoples will emulate. And we're not talking about kashrut. That's an internal thing to connect us to God, Shabbat, but there are certain moral, ethical values in the Torah which we hope become universal. And one of those is often identified as the golden rule, which there's a few ways to say it: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or just other variations of that, but treat others the way you want them to treat you. The thing is, that phrase is not found in the Torah. And the question is, where did it come from? And what we're going to see is when we actually look at the source of it, both for Judaism and ultimately for Christianity as well, where first of all, we're going to see how that connection is made, how the golden rule grew out of it. But one of the questions we're going to look about is, was it originally intended to be a universal principle? When we say the golden rule is treat everyone, was that what the Torah was really talking about? Was it really treat every single human being with that kind of respect? So we're going to look at who that rule was intended for, and then look a little bit about what does it mean to love others? And then the final question is, how did it become a universal principle the way we treat it today, or we ideally treat it today, which is every person you meet, don't treat them any worse than you would treat yourself, or some variation. So the first place to start is right in this week's Parasha, but we're not actually going to look at the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself first, because context is very important. The Parasha of Kedoshim is often called, the section called the Holiness Codes, and it's a mixture of ritualistic laws, but it's also with social and moral laws. And that tells us a lot about how to understand the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself. So we're going to actually, Gloria and Leonard, I will go ahead and unmute you first. And what we'll do, Gloria, is the first section here, it's in chapter 19 that identifies some of the verses. Pay attention to what these laws are telling people to do, how to treat each other. And then Leonard, you'll actually see how it transitions into what our focus is today. So Gloria, please, source number 1.
You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal, and you shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am Hashem.
There's an interesting question about that last thing where it says, I am God. It never explains in the Torah why sometimes it says it, sometimes it doesn't. It could be because these are laws which are less enforceable, because they're not between God and man. There's lots of explanations, but the important takeaway here is all of these laws are about how people treat each other. These are not ritualistic spiritual laws. These are about paying people fairly. These are about, how to build a society. We would talk about, the social contract, or something to that extent. So the question is, what do these have to do with this universal role? So now we're building a society, and actually, Isabel, if it's okay, we'll jump over to you. And any questions, Gloria, Leonard, before we move on?
Nope.
Excellent. So Isabel, the second source here, now we talk about how to build a society, how to treat other people. Now we get into the core of this class. So Isabel, go ahead, please.
You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall reprove your kinsman and not incur guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor like yourself.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead. The I am Hashem. And again, it repeats that. Now, again, clearly, these are laws between people. They're about the relationships between how people treat each other. And there's a few interesting key words here that we'll come back to. When it says, love your neighbor, le'ra'echa, your neighbor, kamocha, like yourself, what does that mean? You know, I love myself, so I'll buy a nice meal, or I'll get myself, a nice book, or I'll take a nap or something like that. So do I have to make sure that my neighbor gets all the sushi that he or she wants? A lot of people joke about that, but what does it mean to love them like yourself? But one of the questions that, again, we'll come back to shortly is, again, practically, what does that mean? What do I actually do to show my neighbor that I have this love and respect for them that I would expect for myself? But the first key here is this. And Isabel, I'll just ask you, because it's bolded here, who are we supposed to love? This law of loving others, who do we direct it for? And again, you can just look at the bold words.
Well, you shall not hate your brother in your heart.
Brother.
You shall reprove your kinsman.
So this word kinsman, which here, amitecha, it's come from the word nation, but specifically someone who's a member of your nation. And then the next one in bold.
You shall bear no grudge or vengeance against your people.
And again, the word b'nei amecha, the children, the members of your people. And then the last word that's somewhat ambiguous, or perhaps not, is neighbor. And a neighbor is, I'm not a neighbor with someone from Korea. I'm a neighbor with someone who lives in Shorewood or Milwaukee City. So brother, your nation, your neighbor. So if we just read this commandment of love, of loving others as yourself, who does it apply to? It only applies to really other Jews, and not even just other Jews who live, relatively close to you. Now, this is not the only time we talk about this kind of love. There is someone else that we apply it to. And then Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this comes up also in our Parsha, a little bit later in the chapter. And it talks about a phrase, ger. Now, the word ger can be translated multiple ways. It can be a resident, meaning someone who's not from the place, but they come to live amongst you. It can mean a stranger or outsider. It can also mean a convert. But all of what those all have in common, it's somebody who was not originally part of your group, and they come and join your group. So go ahead, Jane, now with that in mind about what it means for when it says alien. Again, it's not a judgment on the person. It just means somebody who came from outside and then came to live amongst you. So again, source number 3, please.
When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the native born among you. You shall love the alien like yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am Hashem, your God.
Excellent, thank you. So these people were initially outsiders, but now they get the status of that love. You treat them, and it uses that explicit ve'ahavta, and you should love him, kamocha. It's the exact same language. Love them as yourself. However, this is very explicit. This was a stranger that came from outside, but now where are they living? Where are they living, Jane?
With you.
With you. Mm-hmm. And it says, don't treat them like an outsider once they've lived with you. And it even explains it. Explains that the reason you shouldn't treat them like outsiders is because you used to be
stranger yourself.
Stranger in a strange land. And that actually, I've given the next section here the title about what all of these things, one thing that this has in common between being a Jew, an Israelite, a convert, or even a non-Jew who just lives amongst you, is we all have a shared experience. There is something that ties us all together. And that's one of the things that seems to be common here is this is not a universalist principle of love for all mankind. This is about building a shared experience, a shared sense of community. And when someone joins your community, you want to absorb them, not necessarily assimilate, but you want them to feel like they belong and they deserve the same respect. But it's only when they have become part of your local population. So this doesn't, and by the way, it doesn't mean you have to hate everybody who's not from where you are, but the specific commandment to go above and beyond. And we're going to talk in a minute about what does that mean? What do you actually need to do to show this love? That applies to people who have become a part of your community. And again, it doesn't just mean Jews, although I don't know if I brought a source for it. It becomes pretty clear later that the rabbis understood ger here not as a non-Jew who happens to live next door, but as somebody who joins you and does indeed join your religion. The rabbis limit down that more. Now, that's not necessarily what the Torah means. The Torah may not be so ethno or religious or theocentric that it's only people who convert to the Israelite religion. That's how it's understood later. But here it is definitely neighborhood centric. The mitzvah, the commandment to love, and again, we'll see how that practically is understood, is only for your community. Now, it might be as big as your country, might be the nation of Israel, everyone within the borders, but it doesn't mean people from Texas or people from Australia. The mitzvah, and again, it doesn't mean you have to treat them badly, but these commandments are specifically for your local community. So any questions before we go on to the next section?
So does the idea of saying I am Hashem and all of these make it extremely strong, that it's considered extremely important that these particular mitzvot?
So the answer is that we don't know, because the Torah never explains why it sometimes uses I am God and sometimes doesn't. As I mentioned, one possibility, which is basically what you're saying, is it's to emphasize the importance of it, because if Shabbat is broken, it's not okay, and there's a pretty severe punishment for it, but that's really just between us and God. Whereas these are the fundamental building blocks of civilization. And if civilization falls down and we're mistreating, abusing, that's what the books of the prophets are about. It's not just about the ritual things. It's about how we're not taking care of the poor, etc. And society breaks down. And God says, I forget about me. I don't want your sacrifices. I want you to treat each other right. Because if we're abusing each other and attacking each other, then there's no place or space for God. So I think that what you're saying, there's a lot of truth, that God needs to emphasize how important these are, because without these fundamental building blocks of society, how can we even have space to worship God? Start here. And it could also be that God, at the end of the day, the ritual things are deeply important, but perhaps what is most important to God is building a loving, respectful society. And the way God does that is create a nation that will teach those principles to the world. How do you make that nation cohesive? By creating certain rituals and holidays, et cetera, like that, inculcate them in values, create a bunch of priests, and then have them teach the world about universal values. So we don't know the answer, lots of beautiful ways to look at it, but regardless, these laws are unique and clearly connected. But now we've established that it's pretty clear these laws apply to your local community, not universally. So this next section here is going to look mainly at two different contemporary rabbis. The first one, the Rashbam, is the grandson of Rashi. I think maternal grandson, something like that. And then Avraham ibn Ezra, who often disagreed with Rashi, as did Rashi's grandson. And both of them are going to disagree about what does it actually mean to love your neighbor as yourself. So Susan, if you could please take, I'll actually have you take both because they're so short. So the first one from Rashi's grandson, how does he understand it?
If he's your neighbor, that is, he's a good person like you. But if he's wicked, it is thus written, fear of the Lord is hating the wicked.
Excellent. So what he does here is he takes the word kamocha and turns it into an adjective. Who are you commanded to love? The people that are like you. So like you doesn't become, it becomes, an adjective. In other words, good people. So people that are like you are people that are good like you, assuming that you're a good person. So only people who are similar to you, i.e. good people, are you commanded to love them. If they're wicked people, you don't have to do anything to them. However, there are multiple places in the Torah where we can see clear evidence that the word kamocha is not used as an adjective, that it is clearly used in the way that Avraham ibn Ezra, which is the way that all rabbis use it, that it's not an adjective, but an adverb. So it doesn't mean that the mitzvah only applies to certain people that act in a certain way. Rather, go ahead, Susan, the second source from Ibn Ezra, who I believe is in Spain.
In my opinion, it means what it sounds like, that one should love for good to happen to one's neighbor the way one would love it for oneself.
Excellent. It's not who you love, it's how you love them. Now, that is, again, the way it's understood. And in a moment, we'll talk about, okay, great. So we just read it. He says, just read it the way it's written. But still, what does that mean? To what extent, practically speaking, should I go? How do I show my love? And before we read the next source, we actually saw some great evidence for it by bringing in context. What are some of the ways that you show love to your neighbor? By not defrauding them, not stealing from them, paying them on time, being just towards them, et cetera, by explicitly using the word. In the first source we have here, it says, Lo tashok et re'echa. Don't defraud, don't cheat your neighbor. So all of these laws are showing you, how do you love your neighbor? By not mistreating them, by showing them respect, by not ripping them off. That's how you show love to them. And why? Because you wouldn't want them to rip you off. So it's actually not so, the Torah doesn't make this so complicated. It's not a vague, ambiguous mitzvah. Oh, how do I love them? The Torah says, here are all the ways that you should treat your neighbor. And it's a mitzvah to treat them all these ways, to love them and give them all of the, perform all these mitzvot for them the way you would want them to be performed for you. Here's how you treat them nice. And you should treat them nice because, you want them to treat you nice. So that's how Avram Ibn Ezra understands it. Yeah, go ahead, Susan, please.
Could one possibly translate this as respect rather than love?
Ve'ahavta?
That you, well,
yeah,
I know ve'ahavta means love, but could they mean, you just treat them with the respect that any, that the human being is owed, that you would expect from them?
I would say yes. And I think one reason that it's a yes is because the word respect that we have in English, I don't know that it is a perfect cognate in Hebrew. The word love in Hebrew can mean a lot of different things. It can mean like, it can also mean romantic love. It can mean, we learned about the relationship between David, King David, and Shaul's son, Yonatan, who risked his life to save David. That was presumably not a romantic love, but it was definitely love. So the word love has multiple meanings. And then in terms of the word respect, there's a word kavod, honor. That's not quite the same. And then we often translate the word yirah as respect, but yirah, like yirat Hashem, is really more AWE, awe of God. And we often translate it as fear. So a lot of these words have multiple meanings that don't translate perfectly to English. So I think, yes, Susan, you could definitely do it as respect them by keeping these practical laws about not cheating them the way you would want them to respect you. Now, again, the line between a deep respect for someone and a love of them, even in English, those things are kind of close to each other. When there's someone who we have deep respect for, we do develop a kind of love for them. There are authors and scientists and artists who I have so much respect for, and it borders on not a romantic love, but the way I love reading, the way I love music. So those ideas, respect and love, the line between them is often blurred, and that's fine. That's a good thing. It's just the reality of how we relate to others. So I think that's a great possible read of it, Susan. Now, this last source here, let's see, I'll take this one, is from the 13th century Sefer HaChinuch, and it goes through every mitzvah in the Torah and explains what it is, what it means, etc., who it applies to. It's based off a list from Rambam from Maimonides. It's we don't know who wrote it, but it was clearly written from a son to his father for educational purposes. And the reason it's important is it captures a lot of those things that we just established. So he says, and this is very important, when he titles this mitzvah, he does not say the mitzvah of loving your neighbor. He says in Hebrew, mitzvat ahavat Yisrael, the commandment of love for Israel. So he already establishes right away that this mitzvah only applies to Israel. So remember when I said earlier, there is a separate mitzvah about loving the stranger, but in Sefer HaChinuch, it becomes pretty clear that this whole mitzvah, even the stranger who's an outsider, ultimately you want him to convert. So he says to love with love of the soul, each one of Israel, meaning to say that we have compassion for an Israelite and for his money. Where does he get that? I mean, earlier rabbinic writings, but also the Torah. It's all kind of money things like that. Just like a person has compassion for himself, for his own money. And when they say money here, they don't just mean like money dollars, they mean property. At the end of the day, it doesn't mean I go up to my neighbor and I have to hug them and say, I love you and I care about you. It's nice. But the commandment is I need to protect what is valuable to them, just like I want them to call the police if someone is breaking into my house, because it needs to be tangible. And that's key for the rabbis. If there's a commandment in the Torah to do something, It has to be something that we can do. Even if it seems emotional, have joy. The rabbis say, great. How do we have joy? Some say drinking and eating meat, etc. Some say dancing, etc. The Torah, the rabbis say the Torah cannot command us to do something which is conceptual or emotional. We need hard, concrete actions. So their basic understanding is, how do you love your neighbor as yourself? Protect what is valuable and matters to them, just like you want them to protect what is valuable to you. And while they focus here on property and money, that would also mean my children. God forbid, one of my children, or I'll say a person's child, is about to run into the street. They would hope that their neighbor would be just as concerned and yell, oh my gosh, or grab the child, as this person would do for their children. It's that mutual protection of what is valuable to each other. And he goes on, as it is stated, and he brings the pasuk, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then they bring in a line from the Talmud, which we'll come back to. And they, may their memory be blessed, said in Shabbat, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. We will come back to the context of that verse, because that's where we start hearing hints of the golden rule. So now we've established that this mitzvah is among Jews. The Torah may have meant non-Jews who live amongst you, but again, it's very limited who it applies to. And practically speaking, it's not about who the person is and how they act in life. Anybody who's your neighbor, you treat them the same. And specifically, you protect their property and what's valuable to them, and you hope that it's mutual. Any questions up until now? Excellent. So this last section here, there's two components to it. One is to talk about the way that this law sort of changed in its nature, how it was expressed from love your neighbor as yourself to a more universalist ideal. But then the question is, was that universal ideal still just for Jews? And did it ever get expanded to be for all people, regardless of where they live, whether they're non-Jews? So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'll have you take source 1 and 2. So source 1 here is from the 3rd century. And the reason I brought it in is not only it's relevant, but it's one of the older sources. And it's from a midrash, and it's a direct midrash from the great Rabbi Akiva on how to understand, or not to how to understand, but the importance of this verse. So go ahead, Jane, that one, and I'll have you take the second source as well.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi Akiva says this is a great general principle in the Torah.
Now, he doesn't add so much to the conversation here. Why is it important? Because he is an early rabbi, and when he says this principle is so important to so much of the Torah, because not half, but many, maybe more than half of the mitzvot are how we treat others. And the way we treat others is if we have, as Susan said so beautifully, respect for them. If I need to pay my workers on time and I have respect and love for them because the Torah commandments to, I'll be more inclined to pay them on time. If I am angry at someone, if someone's angry and they want to kill them, but they recognize the godliness in them and they have this universal love for them, they're less likely to injure them because they know they have to show them respect and they don't want people going around killing them. So this principle can be connected to almost every interpersonal, meaning between human being, law in the Torah. Because Rabbi Akiva said it, later rabbis all picked up on it and said, if this is such a core principle, how do we apply it? How do we make it more universal? And that leads to this next story. And what's interesting, the Talmud was written between the 6th and 8th century, but this story is about a rabbi from the 1st century before the Common Era, several hundred years before Rabbi Akiva. So it's not clear whether or not this story is actually true or whether it's something that Hillel might have said. But it's clear that the authors of the story were influenced by Rabbi Akiva's push to make this mitzvah so core to the entire Torah. So go ahead, Jane. And again, we saw this quote earlier. It's from the Talmud, Shabbat 31a. Go ahead.
It happened again that a Gentile came before Shammai. He said to him, convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah as I stand on one leg. He pushed him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. The Gentile came before Hillel, who converted him. He, Hillel, said to him, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole entire Torah. The rest is its explanation. Go and learn.
Oh, yeah. Zeal, go out there and learn it. So it says that phrase, kol ha-Torah kula. This principle is the entire thing. So that very much mirrors, echoes, or perhaps predates, it's not clear, the words of Rabbi Akiva. But a few interesting things here. The person that comes to Hillel, he actually came to Shammai or it says he came to Shammai. Shammai said, get out of here. And then Hillel embraced him, is this person is not identified as a stranger, a ger, he's as a goy. Now that word goy, which means nation, today it kind of has this negative connotation. Oh, they're a goy, it's so bad. It's not what the word goy means. It simply means someone from another nation who's not an Israelite. So someone who's non-Jewish, fine. But that word may have changed. It may have been another word, not necessarily negative, but it may have been something else in an earlier version of the Talmud and edited. But regardless, it's not a ger. It's not a stranger who resides amongst you. It's somebody who wants to be a ger. This person says, Gairani, convert me, make me one of you. And Hillel says, before this person converts, you need to know that one of our core principles is how we treat each other. And the way that you treated Shammai is not the way, and that you treated me and commanded me to convert you. That's not the way we talk to each other, brother. If you want to be a brother to us, you have to understand this is so core to our Torah. Now, he doesn't actually say the mitzvah, and he doesn't reference it directly, love your neighbor as yourself. He says it differently. What is hateful to you, what you don't want others to do to you, don't do it to others. I doubt you would want me to speak to you this way. So how dare you speak to me this way? But it's clear that he is referencing both Rabbi Akiva, or the source is referencing Rabbi Akiva, and that mitzvah from the Torah. So this principle has now been expanded into a more general sense. The language is more universal. However, from all of the context here, it still appears, and the Talmud pretty much backs this up in most cases, except for one we'll see, that this mitzvah and principle really still just applies to Jews and people that want to join the Jews. So how are we supposed to treat non-Jews? Now, there are a number of sources, maybe half a dozen or more, that do actually talk about the way that we should treat non-Jews. And before we read that, Susan, yes, you have your hand up, please.
Yeah, I always thought that Hillel came up with this idea first, but there is another, I guess you could call him a rabbi, between Hillel and Akiva's time.
I didn't mention him if we're thinking about the same person.
Yeah, it gets credit for this do unto other, putting it in the positive light. I always thought that putting it in the negative light was a better idea. But the Akiva, I'm just wondering, we attribute it to Akiva, but if you could just address that question, who really came up with the idea?
I was going to talk about that and how this idea developed and was adopted by Christianity. And of course, Christianity was born out of Judaism, and the early teachers of Christianity were students of and grew up with these principles. So I'm actually going to end with that idea, but that's an excellent and relevant question, one of the ones I said I discussed. But before we do that, I wanted to see if there was a principle in the Mishnah, which it didn't predate Christianity per se, but it was definitely an early enough source in the Roman times that it would have been part of the conversation that both Jews and Christians were having. So this last source, it's in the Talmud, but it comes from the Mishnah. And Susan, why don't you go ahead? As you said, your mistake is always you ask a question that I have you read. And it does explicitly talk about the way to treat non-Jews, but it's interesting the reason it gives for it. And it doesn't bring up the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself. So go ahead, source number 3, please.
The Mishnah teaches one does not protest against poor Gentiles who come to take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and the produce of the corner of the field, which is given to the poor, although they are meant exclusively for the Jewish poor on account of the ways of peace. Similarly, the sages taught in the Baraita, one sustains poor Gentiles along with poor Jews, and one visits sick Gentiles along with sick Jews, and one buries dead Gentiles along with dead Jews. All this is done on account of the ways of peace, to foster peaceful relations between Jews and Gentiles.
Excellent. So that last sentence is not actually in this source. Only the bolded is the Hebrew, but that last phrase, on account of the ways of peace, darchei shalom, literally the pathways of peace, it explains it beautifully. The reason, all of these different mitzvot are, again, interpersonal ones about taking care of poor, taking care of the people of the city, helping people in their time of grief when they've lost someone, to give them a proper burial. Now, it doesn't go through the full list that we saw in Kedoshim about not cheating and stuff like that. I'll come to that in a moment. But the reason to do all of these things for the non-Jews who are not Jews, they're not Israelites, nor are they considered really ger. They're not considered resident strangers who either are converts or who have become part of your community, but even though they might live there, this is a time when the diaspora started and Jews were outside. But the reason you treat non-Jews you allow them to do this is because you don't want to cause conflict. You do it because ultimately it's the right thing to do, but it's the right thing to do because if you don't do this, they're not going to treat you nicely. So it goes back to that universalist golden rule. But the reason to do this is not because of the commandment of love. Love your neighbor of yourself is not the reason that we do these things for non-Jews. We do it because we want to create good relations. And another source that I didn't bring here is in the Talmud. It's in the sections of, I believe, it's Bava Kamar Mitzia. It's those sections that deal with civil laws, I think 115a. And it talks about this rabbinic principle that is permitted to steal from a non-Jew. It's explicit. Gezel, goy, stealing from a non-Jew, or gezelaku mutar, is permitted. And that's so disturbing, and it is to the rabbis of the Talmud. But they can't just say, no, that's not true, because it's an idea which is passed down. So they can't just say, well, the mitzvah says, Ahavat Yisrael, we have to love our others, so we can't steal from them. It doesn't apply to non-Jews. So they have to come up with another reason to not go around stealing from non-Jews. And it gets very uncomfortable. And ultimately what they come down to is don't steal from non-Jews because it would be a chilul Hashem. It would desecrate the name of God and look bad for our people. And it's just a horrible thing to do. And then actually in another source, they say, don't steal from non-Jews. In fact, go out of your way to be good to them and to be righteous with them so that people will say, oh, how beautiful is the God of Israel that the Jews are so honest with their money. And unfortunately, have a bad history of getting a negative association with money. But the key there is, why do we treat non-Jews right? Not because there's a commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, but because we don't want to get a bad rap and people will curse the name of God. But at the end of the day, in all of the rabbinic sources, all the oral tradition, the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself never applies to anyone outside of the community, nation of Israel. And the reality, now coming back to your question, Susan, I am not a scholar of Christianity, so I'm basing this off of a number of other articles, is that when one looks at all of the speeches given by Jesus and by his apostles, is that they never, they talk about this principle a lot and how you treat others, and they often use the language, the more universal language about not hating others in your heart, is that it appears that they're also only talking about their community, that they're not talking about treating the Romans with love. So in Judaism and Christianity, they do share that this commandment, and that's the key here, not that we can just mistreat other nations for no reason, but the command to love the neighbor as yourself, the basis of the golden rule, really just applies at home. And the reason to treat other nations with respect is because you don't want to cause a war. You don't want to cause other conflict. So then the question becomes, when did it become a universalist principle that we treat all mankind, all human beings with this? Now, there's one rabbi in the Talmud, Ben Azai, who is not rejected, but he's a minority opinion, who maybe possibly, I didn't bring it, maybe you could interpret him to say that it applies to all human beings, because ultimately, if it only applies to people in one shared family, well, we are in a shared family because of great-great-grandpa Adam and Eve and Grandma Eve. But that opinion really doesn't, it's beautiful if that's what he means, but it never picks off. So it's not actually clear. And I'm sure there's some historical sources much later when it, is all mankind, but it's probably relatively recent that the golden rule is about all mankind. But to say that Christianity took it and they made it for all mankind, that's not true either. Now, to say that it's about your home and building a community with shared experience, it's not a bad thing. That's not an amoral, unethical thing to do, but it's important to understand the mitzvah and what it was intended to do. And it was intended to create a cohesive community that would look out for each other, that would care for each other, that would take shared responsibility for the way that each other are treated. And more importantly, if somebody wants to join that group, to give them the same rights. And as you said, Susan, beautifully, respect. Whether we use the word love or not, it's treat others with respect to create a cohesive community. Now that we have a global community, this mitzvah does take on other connotations, but strictly speaking, any contemporary work on the mitzvot today, the mitzvah does not apply to people who are outside of the Jewish faith or outside residents of Israel. But even though that mitzvah is more limited than many people give it credit for, and they think, well, Christianity is the one who expanded it, which it doesn't appear that they did, what going back to what I said initially about Judaism is supposed to establish principles that are supposed to be shared and copied by mankind. It is a principle which it's clear that the rabbis did kind of want to emulate for others. And more importantly, at the end of the day, when I was preparing this class, I was like, please, I need to find something that says we still treat non-Jews with respect. I found it. The reasons may not be the mitzvah, but at the end of the day, as going back to Ibn Ezra, what really matters is not so much about who it applies to, it's how you treat someone. And at the end of the day, the rabbis established that whether it's for the mitzvah, ways of peace, darchei shalom, or causing people to bless and not curse the name of God, we still treat all mankind with respect. So practically speaking, the universalist, the golden rule is really about how you treat people, not necessarily why you treat them that way.